Good morning, everybody. The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you. Excuse me, just got honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Heather Dillashaw from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. We're excited about today's training session. It is a part of our racial equity series and is entitled Institutional Transformation, Becoming an Anti-Racist Organization. And it is my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Dr. Rajni Shankar Brown.
Oh no.
We can hear you, Rajni.
Second. I know. Give me 1 second. That was an intentional I know. Let me pull up my PowerPoint again. There we go. Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. I am so happy to be in this space together. And Donald and I are really looking forward to some good dialogue and learning. Thank you all for being here. We hope that this will be a helpful resource and give several ideas and resources to also share out in our communities as well. ICF will, of course, record and the slides will be shared. And if you need anything else as we go, feel free to drop it in the chat as well. We're not going to look at individual messages. So if you can do it as a group, it'll be easier. But we will make sure that we get back to you and support however needed. So in this slide, as we start today, we start with kind of a contemplative pause. This is a mural by Amanda, wonderful artist in Norwalk, Iowa. And so if you ever go to Iowa, you can kind of visit it. It's pretty grand in scale. But I love this mural, right? It has the word grow. You see individuals contemplative in reflective pose, lots of greenery in different colors, vibrant, diverse colors kind of growing. You also see this kind of hopeful sun, right? This ball of energy, whether you see it as the sun or the moon. And when we talk about cultural humility, it is really a lot about growth. And it's about being centered in our shared humanity. And so when I see this mural, to me, it really reflects kind of some of the beauty and the promise and hope that cultural humility holds. And so I start us with this grounding today. So I am Rajni Shankar Brown. I am an associate rep and the president of the National Coalition for the Homeless Board of Directors. I'm also a professor and endowed chair of social justice education at Stetson University. And cultural humility is something that I am very passionate about, and just grateful that ICF and everybody for making space for this as we kind of ongoingly grow and reflect. And I'm going to turn the mic over to my amazing colleague, dear friend and mentor, Donald Whitehead.
Thank you, Rajni, and thank all of you for joining us today, and really appreciate those who have regularly been a part of these discussions. I'm Donald Whitehead. I am one of the co-founders of Racial Equity Partners. I've been working in the field of homelessness for a little bit over 28 years, a little bit longer in the racial equity sphere. I started my career with racial equity at Greenpeace, where I worked on environmental racism. So filtered throughout my career as a homeless service provider and advocate, starting with outreach all the way to the executive director positions at a couple of organizations, case management, housing placement, veterans programs, have really run the gamut of kind of what is offered in the homeless service delivery spectrum, but was also have worked in a couple of cities in advocacy roles, including the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless, the 10-year plan in Baltimore, and the National Coalition for the Homeless. This is my second stint there, as I've been to both president of the board of directors and also executive director twice. So bring that experience, have also worked on board of the Georgetown Center on Cultural Competency. So have throughout my career been very focused, interested, and excited about addressing the issues of racism and cultural competency, cultural humility, and also the issue of ending homelessness. So thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to a very expansive and inclusive conversation. So for today's agenda, we're going to do, we've done just a little bit of an overview of this series, and we'll do a little bit more about just the cultural competency aspects of it. We started with a historical analysis. We've done, I think, 8 different workshops at this time, at least from a racial equity lens, everything from involving people with lived experience to becoming anti-racist organizations. And this particular series is cultural humility and cultural competency. So there will be a series of 4 different workshops on this. So we'll do a little bit of grounding. We'll talk about cultural and social identities. There'll be some discussion. We always want to have this be inclusive. Actually, there's only 3 workshops. We'll talk about cultural humility, the context, the definition, and characteristics. Another small group discussion. We'll then go into the benefits of cultural humility. And finally, we'll open it up for your questions, comments, and discussion. So that's our agenda for today. Thank you for being here again. And we look forward to some great interaction. Back to you, Rashni.
Thank you, Donald. So as we get started today, just a bit of engagement and grounding for us. We engage with the content and each other so that we can maximize our learning. We will be present, actively listen, and speak our truth. We speak with positive intentions. Intentions don't equal impact on others, so we apologize when we make a mistake. And in this space, and always, part of cultural humility is encouraging all of us to be human, right? So sometimes I think we feel we have to be perfect or be, in these kinds of not as authentic to ourselves, right? And part of cultural humility is showing up in our authenticity. So we encourage that here today. We assume that participants have good intentions until proven otherwise. And we ask questions so we can all learn from each other. So, this is our 3-part series that we're going to be doing. We have a lot to cover, a lot to talk about, but we also have made this series have space and time for us to also do reflection and take theory into application, which is a huge part of advancing cultural humility. And so we're going to look at the continuum of cultural consciousness. We're going to really dive into what is the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility. We're going to look at some of the key principles of cultural humility, the benefits of embracing and practicing cultural humility. And we will talk about benefits from multiple levels, from individual all the way into kind of larger and collective community levels. We're going to look at systems levels, and application of cultural humility. And we're also going to talk about promising practices, different things that we can all add to our toolbox as we strengthen our commitment to engage in cultural humility, to embrace it and to actively practice it, and also to promote it in our communities and in our world. So here you see kind of a multiple of different identities listed, right? What we know is we all have different social identities. Our social identities do not often just exist in silos, but actually intersect in very real ways. So for a very long time, when we've talked about social identities, even from psychological and education frameworks, we really talked about them in these kind of isolated boxes. Now what we know is there's a lot of intersection. So it's important for us to give space and honor those individual identities, but also understand the vital intersections between identities. So we have, ability listed here, mental health, gender expression, appearance, race, age, gender identity, personality. You can see it kind of goes on and on, right? Language, even location, thinking about regions where we live, understanding differences between race and ethnicity, although often used interchangeably, right? They are distinct and different. And so a big part of cultural humility is first understanding and going inward to say what shapes our lenses, our beliefs. What are the different cultures that have informed our own lenses and beliefs and have helped shape us as people, who we are today, right? And how does that influence how we are seeing the world or seeing others who are similar and different than us? So here you kind of see again this idea of social identities, intersectionality, and the critical importance of self-reflection. So again, part of when we do self-reflection, we have to actually kind of break out initially into silos, these different facets, so we can dig deeply into them. But then it's really important we step back and we start to kind of look at the overall puzzle or even web, right? A kind of a tangled web is a really good image to kind of think about the intersections between our identities. Every single one of us has different social identities, right? Different ethnicity, different gender, different age. And what we know, cultural humility emphasizes also that even how we A, perceive, but B, experience our social identities can often be very different as well, because it's also influenced by things like context, situation, environment, right? Environmental influences. And so these are all things that we have to make space for, and we have to be willing to kind of dig into the complexities. It's not sometimes so neat, right? And it can be kind of messy, but yet it's really important for us to dig a bit deeper into this work and to especially start in a place of self-reflection. So I'm going to turn it back over to Donald. We're going to do a little small group application now. Donald, you're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. And want to go into some small group discussion. And there are 4 questions here that we want you to dive into. Are we going to go into groups, or we're going to divide into groups?
Yes,
Okay.
we're going to divide into small groups. And I will, these are the questions that we're going to think about, right? So what identities do you think about most often? See, we saw a lot of different social identities listed, right? What are the identities you personally think about most often? And what do you think about least often? And think about also some of these key identities that you identify, are they visible or are they invisible? Because we also have some identities, right? Social identities that may be invisible, where people don't really see them, but they're a core part of our own identity. And then what identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? So this is in your opinion, right? In spaces that you work in communities that you work with, what are the identities that you think have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? So just engage in some authentic, good reflection. This is a big part of cultural humility, so we wanted to make space for this.
I'll go ahead and open the rooms.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen.
So my question was more about, had the rooms been created? Because I don't have the
Oh.
ability to do that. I just wanted to make sure it was done. But
I've
thank
got
you
you.
for going ahead there, Rajni.
Gotcha, Donald. Sorry, I didn't know what you were asking me. You're muted, Donald.
Yeah, I don't have the ability myself to break out rooms, so I didn't know if you had already done that. I didn't So I
Yeah,
wanted to make
Kristen
sure
and
we,
I'm so glad because Kristen and Heather are kind of handling all that for us. I'm just doing slides though. I'm turning our slides for us, but they're
right,
handling all
no, yeah, so I didn't know who was doing that. That's all. That's why I was stopping. So.
It's all Kristen. I don't know. I don't even know how to do it.
Yeah, and I panicked because I don't, if you have if you're a co-host, you have the ability to do it, which I know how to do, but I didn't see it, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't expected to do it. So, um,
Kristen, you're kind of a tech whiz, aren't you? Because I've seen Kristen in so many different spaces where things have popped up and Kristen's jumped in with the text. Kristen really wears all the hats, I think, with technology.
How long, we didn't say how long folks would be in their rooms for.
Oh, okay. We can put a message out to them to
Yep.
let them know. So let me look at what we have in our schedule here. Hold on.
Sure.
it's from 11:25 to 11:40, so they have 15 minutes.
Do you think that's a good amount of time? Too much time?
Let's see, what time is it now? It is
11:18.
11:18. I think that's good because they can go through all the questions that way, and it's going to have some organic conversation. So let's maybe keep to it. What do you think, Donald?
I think that's fine. I think, it gives them enough space to actually, experience being able to do it. So yeah, that should work.
Okay, I will broadcast to them that they are going to be in there until 11:40.
That sounds good. And then maybe right before 11:40, that we can do the minute countdown for them too, so it doesn't abruptly.
That's 20 minutes instead of 15 if we do that.
Yeah, we're ahead of schedule right now.
So let's
Oh,
do
gotcha.
15 since they're smaller groups. Let's do 15 minutes, so like 11:35.
Okay,
Perfect, perfect.
I'll broadcast a message.
And hopefully they're engaging because I know we've had a couple of times when people said nobody said anything in the room.
Well, I did make Rajni and Donald, I made you both co-hosts. So
Okay,
you should be able to jump into the rooms if you are interested in seeing how the conversation is going.
awesome.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen.
Sure. And I think I'll go ahead and join one of the rooms right now. I'll jump into room one. That way, Donald or Rajni, if you decide you want to jump into a room, then room two is available.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if folks heard me there. Has anyone popped into room 2 to see where they're at, or?
So I did not, Kristen. I don't know if Rajni or Heather did, but I didn't.
Okay. Rajni, are you with us right now? Yeah, I don't think that
She
she
may have
is.
stepped away
Hi,
for a second.
Kristen.
Oh, hi. Okay, good. You are there.
Yes,
So-
I can hear you. I didn't step in. I didn't want to interrupt discussion since they had already started. So I didn't step into it. But when we come back full group, we're going to have everybody kind of share out a little bit as well and kind of add and kind of deepen the discussion.
Should we check to see how room 2 is doing? Because room 1 is done.
We can, but I think there's only a minute left. So since
Oh.
there's only 1 minute, they're going to
Okay.
come back in the main room in a second.
Perfect.
And
I'm going to give them.
honestly, you said you made us co-host.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you made Rajni co-host. So I'm not able to jump in and out. I have to be a co-host too to be able to jump in and out.
Oh, I thought I did make you one, but I'll check on that after I give the 1 minute warning to everybody.
Okay, because you have to get that. You can't see it unless you're host or co-host.
Right. Okay, Donald, you are a co-host. I thought I had, but I had not.
No worries.
All right, I gave everyone the 30-second warning. They should be coming back pretty soon here.
Yeah, that warning doesn't it doesn't hold up at all. You have some people in the waiting room as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I let in 2 people too while we were meeting, but I don't know if they moved in. Hopefully they did. Okay.
I've got them all set. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you, Kristen.
Oh, thank you.
Donald, did you see my message?
Yeah, the one that I keep doing and not doing.
And when we bring them back, we have time. So since we have that time, why don't we do a little bit of full group? What do you think of that?
Sure. No, I think that's great. Want to get them talking to each other. Oh, get you all talking to each other because you all can hear exactly what I'm saying, can't you? It looks like everybody may be back. So,
Yeah.
we'd love to hear a few of you share about what you discussed in your small groups. If you want to unmute yourselves and hopefully we can see some of your faces as well. But we'd love to hear any of the discussions that you may have had in your small group. So if anybody is open to sharing, love to hear from you. Is that Jillian? Did you want to share, Jillian?
I was really just making my screen visible, but I can share. I'm good with that.
Oh, thank you. And it's nice to see you, Jillian. I love that color, that blue.
Oh, thank you. It's a city issued shirt, so thank the city. So the questions were, what identities do you think about most often? And in my group, a lot of us shared that we think about our being female and how that affects us and how people notice that about us as well. That's something I definitely shared, and that's something I think about often as I just kind of walk around in this world, and how people kind of treat me based on that. And it's not necessarily bad or good, but I think that they make a decision as to how they're going to respond to me. And sometimes I think about if they're responding to me in a certain way because I am a woman or female or whatever. So, and then what identities do I think about least often? I don't really think about that I'm Mexican that often, and I think it's because I'm not really that connected to that part of my culture anymore.
Mm.
Just because I think I've shared in previous groups that we lost a lot of that when I was growing up because of like the school system.
Mm,
So we weren't allowed to speak Spanish in the household, and we didn't practice a lot of that. And I know in one um, presentation we had, one of the speakers shared that, oh, well, I'm not that kind of Mexican. And that's basically how I feel. And most of my adulthood is I'm just not that kind of Mexican anymore. Not that I wouldn't want to be more connected to that, but it's just what it turned out to be. And it says, are these identities visible or invisible? I definitely think that being female is visible, and people can see that part of me. Um, and what identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? I still think it's um, being a woman. I think that, like, I think Christine shared, being able to negotiate with jobs, and people thinking that I'm not as accomplished as I am, and
mhm,
very surprised when I tell them who I am. And I've done the same thing with other women. I remember being on a bus, or not, I was on a train, and I sat next to a woman in scrubs, and I asked if she was a nurse, and she said that she was like a surgeon or something. And I was
mm,
like, oh my God, I'm so sorry for assuming that you're just a nurse. Not that nurses are not as qualified, but
yeah.
they're seen, they're, perceived as not a doctor. Doctors are held in a more high esteem. So I know I've been guilty of the same thing, but so that's my share.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Very, very insightful. Really appreciate all of your comments. We would certainly love to hear from anyone else who is willing to join us in courageous conversations today.
And really,
Anyone else?
really quick, Donald, I just want to share something, Jillian, in response. Thank you for sharing that. And I just wanted to say, so, August 26th, right, was Women's Equality Day. And it was kind of a day around the world to look at, also for all of us to contemplate ongoing kind of biases that happen, that women face every day. And it was really interesting. They've continued to do these studies to show, again, with pay, there's inequities, but a lot of it stems from kind of bias of women being presumed incompetent, right, or not able to do a role, but also internalized bias. They did these studies where I'll try to drop the link because you all might find this very interesting. There's a short video where they set up this scenario and they talk about a father and a son, and the father is the CEO, and they talk about the CEO also calls him, and who do you think the CEO is? It's kind of like a riddle. And they did this scenario, and it happens that the other CEO is his mom. The mom is the CEO, but nobody guessed it was a mom or a woman. Everybody says grandfather, uncle, brother, a totally different man. It's just, you'll have to watch it, but it really was interesting because they did the study all over the nation. And it kind of was what you just shared about, the assumption of a nurse versus a doctor, right? And they found that over and over again in all, genders, right? And across even, race and ethnicities, diversity. And so really kind of interesting to think about that and how that plays out, and the work we have to do to still break those biases and those stereotypes and barriers that so many continue to face. So thank you. That really resonated when you shared. I just had to add in there.
Well, thank you very much. Again, anyone else want to come off mute and share? And if you don't feel comfortable sharing openly, we could certainly get your comments in the chat, and we will be your megaphone for those. But we love to hear from some of you. Anybody else who any of those 4 questions, if your group had any discussion about them, we'd love to hear from you.
And I just noticed in the chat group too, we're so sorry. It seems you all had some audio issues. So if anybody from group 2 wants to kind of share here as a part of the reflective practice, please do. You're welcome to kind of share some out loud here. There's a lot of benefit to kind of being able to share and articulate. It's part of that reflective process with cultural humility. So feel free to share.
Well, it looks like we will have to wait till our next breakout session to get to hear from some of you. And again, we'd love to see your faces if you want to join us by camera. I know looking at your cell phone camera all day can get old after a while, but this is a setting where we benefit from getting to see your face. So we will go to our next part of the discussion. And that's going to be a little bit about some of the characteristics that help define culture. So here are some of the characteristics that define culture. Some of them, of course, are a little bit more identifiable when it comes to characteristics of culture. And we certainly, when we think about the idea of culture, these are some of the places that we go. But one thing, you see that big box, it says, remember, culture is not dynamic. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Culture is dynamic, it's not static, meaning that culture changes over time. All of the things under culture will change over time. So it doesn't stay in the same place. There's quite a bit of movement when we think about the definition and terms that define culture. These things are always changing: language and traditions and art. The norms that we have in our society around culture change all the time. The values, physical objects, mores, attitudes, knowledge, the symbols, the rite of initiation, and the rituals. So just think about over your lifetime how many of those things have dramatically changed. The art, whether it's the expression of art during the Harlem Renaissance or back in our ancient history, kind of the norm in art has changed quite a bit. Andy Warhol and some of the other great painters and artists of our time are very different. And so we know that those things change. We know that language changes. We know that my kids come up with a new word every month and I have to embrace that. And so we know that within our culture, there are these new norms. I mean, the idea on this call of identifying ourselves with pronouns is kind of a cultural change. It's a shift that has recently happened, and some of the terms we use in terms of how we identify ourselves have changed. If we think about, physical objects within a culture, or what kind of clothing you wear, not many people wear platforms or bell bottoms. That was pretty cool in my day, but we don't see a lot of people. And the thing about when we think about clothing and culture, that will shift over time. Sometimes it comes back. Sometimes people do wear that stuff that we wore 30 years ago. Our attitudes about things, there are things in our culture that we have accepted, but things that have become normalized in our culture, that's very different over periods of time. I mean, there's a lot more liberty when it comes to, especially like our media. Our media has changed over time, and we accept things in a very different way than we did earlier in our history of the world, in our history, in our culture. The rites of initiation into a culture, how you assimilate into a different culture if you go from country to country. You heard Jillian talk about someone saying, I'm not that kind of Mexican, for instance. And so what does that mean? So what are people accepting when we're thinking about culture? Was it the culture that you were born into, or culture that developed over time, and how do we accept that? Some of our rituals I can think about, when I think about the African-American culture around the holiday season, there are all these different expressions of people's religious beliefs. There's Kwanzaa and there's Christmas, and there's other people that celebrate in other ways. Jewish people celebrate very differently. So religion plays a large role in our culture. And people have many, many different expressions of that. And again, they change over time. None of this stuff is actually static. Of all the things we've talked about, we have different traditions. Some people have loved the idea of Thanksgiving all of their life. But as people start to dig deeper into culture and the experiences of marginalized groups, some people don't celebrate that in the same way anymore. There are the cultures that are associated, all kinds of traditions associated with our culture that we have seen dramatically change. The music, what we accept as far as music, the kinds of music, and some in our society will really never assimilate. They will continue to use the beliefs that they have, and some people put different New Year celebrations, Mexican New Year, Chinese New Year, Parisian New Year. So yes, so within our different identities, there's all these cultural norms that happen. And again, they shift over time. They're very different depending on where you are. You don't change as a person, but your culture may change. So those are some of the things that really define our culture. I gave you a few examples, but this list could be endless. And those are some things within those particular characteristics that we can talk about. So excuse me. So on the next slide, we just go right into the definition of cultural humility. It is a process that requires humility, and therefore humility is part of the definition. Each has something of great value to learn from others. So really, cultural humility is really digging into understanding another's culture and being able to have the humility to want to learn more. As individuals continuously engage in self-reflection and self-critique as lifelong learners and reflective practitioners to redress power imbalances, to develop mutually beneficial, non-patronalistic partnerships and care. Paternalistic, I'm sorry. So yes, paternalistic partnerships and care. And that's non-paternalistic because we do often in our culture come at things from a paternalistic point of view where we don't allow people to embrace things on their own. We're guiding them. We're kind of directing them. We're prescriptive, and that's not really cultural humility. That's not really allowing people to have their own beliefs and understanding and values. And so that's what cultural humility is: having the inner strength and the inner awareness to be able to reflect on oneself and critique oneself and understand that although there is a different culture, it isn't any less valuable. It isn't less important. It is just it's just different. It's not that one has any more value than the other. So really, in order to get to a point of cultural humility, an important point is that you have to know yourself and you have to be self-reflective enough to embrace the differences between others. It's also really adjusting and understanding the history of that other culture and other cultures, especially some of the marginalized groups. Examples are knowing that if you're a practitioner of homeless services, knowing that there is often a distrust that has been brought into the situation by cultural beliefs, also by practices of other groups in the community. So when I think about the criminalization of homelessness, I know what that level of distrust brings into the conversation. And so that cultural dynamic is sometimes going to make it very hard to get through to that person. It also may have to do with other issues within the history of that culture. So another example might be a distrust of medical providers that came from years and years of experimentation. We learned that through COVID, that there was an apprehension among people of color to engage in the vaccines because people were reflecting back on the Tuskegee experiments and other intersections of marginalization that occurred in their culture. So understanding that uh, gives you the opportunity to be able to break through, use your cultural humility, and come up with a strategy that allows you to get to those people that need whatever that service is. So building trust with people that are homeless, that may have been criminalized, they may have been swept in their encampments, rebuilding that trust in spite of. So understanding what people are bringing to the table when you're working with them. And so on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about, again, about, let's look at another definition of cultural humility. Cultural humility involves an ongoing process of self-exploration and self-critique, combined with a willingness to learn from others. It means entering a relationship with another person with the intention of honoring their belief, their custom, and their values. It means acknowledging differences and accepting the person for who they are. And this is so important in our work with homeless people or people experiencing homelessness. I'm sorry, we have to always be, we have to always utilize person-centered language. It's so important to understand cultural, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences between competency and humility a little later, but it's not just having people and resources to help people, but it's also having the knowledge and humility to understand that difference. So, we know in some cultures, there's a distrust of the government, and there's a distrust of the system that is provided, and that is in many different cultures. So being a filter to make sure that that process is less of a overwhelming process for our clients. Making sure that we don't, for instance, in a community that has a distrust of the police department, we don't do outreach with the police department. So understanding, and those are just a couple of examples. Again, there's many, many different examples, but the bottom line is the bottom line in this definition. It says it means acknowledging differences and expecting that person for who they are, excuse me, accepting that person for who they are. So we know that people, again, bring so many things to the table, and being able to accept that and having the willingness and the intention around learning who that person is. So sometimes it takes some extra research to understand why that person isn't connecting with you. This also brings into play so many techniques that we should be using, we don't always use. Motivational interviewing, for one, actively listening, because people will always tell you their culture, they're proud of their culture, they're proud of their belief system, but we have to actively listen to be able to embrace it. So many of the practices and techniques that we're taught really help us to be able to be conscious of the need for cultural humility and being able to apply it in the work we do with people across the table from us. So the next slide. So let's dig just a little deeper. Cultural humility involves an ongoing process of self-exploration and self-critique, combined, and again, I want to stress, with a willingness to learn from others. So it isn't something that comes naturally. So it's an active process to be willing to learn from others. Cultural humility means entering a relationship with another person with the intention of honoring their beliefs, customs, and values. Again, these are all active things. These are all not things that come natural, but we have to remind ourselves and be intentional about honoring beliefs, customs, and culture. Some people, as another example, some cultures do not like physical touch. So we have to be conscious of that. It's not a good idea anyway, but some people are huggers and some people are handshakers, and not all customs believe that. So it takes an intentional effort to learn that about a different culture of people. And it really does make our work a lot easier when we're investigators of culture, when we start to really acknowledge the need and are intentional about it. Cultural humility means acknowledging differences and accepting people for who they are. Again, people are very different, but if we're accepting of them, it makes our work so much easier. Cultural humility is not an end all and be all of learning, but a dynamic and ongoing process. Remember, we first talked about that it's a dynamic process. It's ever changing. And the only way you learn about that change is if you actively listen with intention and learn about people. And really embrace them for who they are and allow active listening to tell you who they are and allow you to move in a direction that embraces their differences. Cultural humility is a lifelong commitment to learning and critical self-reflection. And again, these aren't one-offs. They're not be-alls and end-alls. They're a process, and they're a lifelong process. You have to continuously be learning. None of us have all of the information necessary for cultural humility to work. And so we have to continue to go back again and again to reflect on ourselves and also embrace the differences in others. Cultural humility is a commitment to address power imbalances and advance justice, equity, diversity and inclusion. I'm having such a hard time reading today, so please forgive me. A part of racial equity that's really important is understanding that power dynamic and the imbalance and working actively to help to have the person on the other side of the table be able to get to a point where they feel like they're on a level playing field, and also to create structures within our organizations and agencies to make sure that we do address those power imbalances. Very, very important to do in DEI, in racial equity, and just in general. If we really examine ourselves, do some self-reflection, we start to understand kind of the power of the imbalance of power and how that affects people and causes resistance at sometimes. So really important to understand that. And so these come from the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project. And so for the next slide. So our next slide, I think, is actually me turning it over to Rajni, I think. And so Rajni, as I mentioned, is going to go into cultural competency versus cultural humility.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Donald. That was beautiful. And there's a lot there, right, to unpack. And something I just want to share, right, that very first definition that Donald shared of cultural humility. Something to kind of know just in terms of history is cultural humility itself has actually kind of evolved. So I'm going to go back here for 1 second, right? So this was a definition in 1998. It came from, Melanie Turvalon and Jan Murray Garcia. And they are both professional healthcare, leaders in the field of healthcare who actually coined the term cultural humility. And they initially brought it to educate physicians who are working with culturally diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse individuals and populations. Since then, cultural humility has branched out, right? Or understanding has even expanded in ways, and now really crosses over into all the different fields, from social work and counseling to education, sociology, right? Psychology. There are so many different implications in that way. When we think about cultural competency and cultural humility, there are some real differences, right? And one difference I'll just share is, one of the also kind of pieces when cultural humility originated was to distinguish itself from this idea of cultural competence, because cultural competence actually kind of operates from a stance where whiteness is understood and represented as the norm, right? So whiteness is the norm, and then we're going to go and try to understand other cultures within the white frame, right? Now, cultural humility pushes a bit against that, right? A lot against that, right? Because part of it is actually saying we're going to challenge some of these power imbalances, right? So part of the work is, even if I have sort of normative beliefs and lenses, being able to understand what those are, but also being able to kind of allow those to be set aside so I can truly listen and learn from others and understand that somebody else's perspective, their experiences, honoring that is really important, right? And in terms of shared humanity, it has as much value as my own. So there's a lot of differences and pieces, right? And so you see here, cultural competency is also seen as kind of a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies. And it comes from system, agency, or professionals. It enables a system, agency, or professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. And so cultural competence focuses a lot on just kind of skill sets. How do I navigate, right? And cultural competence, having that is a necessary skill set in many different jobs. But what we know is if we are committed to advancing equity, advancing justice, inclusion, affirming diversity, cultural humility calls on us to go much deeper. It asks us to maintain an interpersonal stance that is oriented, right, with the people we are interacting with, the person that we are interacting with. And it allows aspects of cultural identity of that person to become the most important for me to reframe my own lens or view. Now, cultural humility, right, is also different because there's not just an end point. In cultural competency, there's often kind of a checklist, and you can kind of reach an end point, right, where, okay, I've accomplished this, I'm done, right? In cultural humility, it says there is never, ever an end point. When we're talking about culture and learning about culture and understanding, we have to understand that we are all human beings. We are all in a world that, you know, where we, from the time we come out of the womb, we are bombarded with different messaging. So we've got to really, this is where the dynamic piece comes in, right? That it's dynamic, that there is a commitment to, again, do ongoing self-exploration. So even when we did the small groups earlier today, right? And even if you group 2, right? We're not able to with audio issues. The slides are going to be shared out. And one thing that we encourage everyone to do, right, is just take some time individually to go back and think about those different questions. Part of cultural humility says we're going to make an ongoing commitment to engage in reflective practice. And that reflection starts with introspection, right? Understanding and critiquing even ourselves, our own biases, our own identities that we carry, knowing that frames things in the world. And then also that commitment to learn from others. And not just learn from others, but really honor others, honor diverse cultures, diverse traditions, right? Donald earlier went over all the different facets and dimensions of culture. And there are so many, right, that are so important, right? And this goes back to, again, you know, if you look here, there's been a lot of research, Levy, Bilbray, the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project. You can find hosts of research, right? My own research I'm doing now, it really looks at also the systemic pieces that cultural humility plays. So it's not just kind of an individual response, but when we think about systems level changes, structural changes, policies and practices that need to be changed, especially to advance equity, to advance justice, cultural humility actually plays a big part in that, right? It can play a big part in that. It has a very powerful potential. So let's take a look at some more specific examples here. So cultural competence, right? Often once you kind of receive, certification that you are now culturally competent, it says I'm the expert, right? I understand. I've taken courses in culture and now I'm an expert, right? Cultural humility says, no, right? You're the expert. It again recognizes that every individual has expertise in their own identities and shaping. It also works to amplify a lot of the messiness and complexity, right? That it's not so clean. A lot of times, if you pick up books around cultural, multicultural, even education, right, from the past, and really the focus on cultural competence, you'll find that while there may be a lot of good things in terms of skill sets being taught, there's a lot of things that perpetuate a lot of injustices too, including stereotypes. Right? Stereotyping an entire culture, where I just picked up a textbook the other day. We're doing a study where we're kind of analyzing a lot of texts that are used in higher education right now, right? And so there's these kind of lumping of, when you're teaching Asian students, you do this, right? Well, the reality is Asia is a huge continent, and there's a lot of diversity within Asian cultures, Asian communities, and even within communities that may be similar, there can be lots of diversity, right? And so to kind of, in some ways, I think as humans, we like to put everything kind of tidy and in boxes, and it makes things feel efficient. But a lot of cultural humility says, it's important to recognize the complexities, to push back on some of that, to understand that we're going to place and center diversity in a true active form, right? Along with equity, which understands, again, there has to be lifelong learning in this work, in the work that we do. Another example with cultural competence is that it is an end product, right? Again, coming to an end. Cultural humility says, no, it is a lifelong process. It is something we have to intentionally commit ourselves to doing, and it has to be ongoing. So even as we do this work, as we're in this series together, right, we're going to do these 3 workshops. That is awesome, but we have to commit way further than that, that we're constantly going back and doing the reflection and thinking and pausing in the busyness of life to do this heavy work, right? All of us, collectively too. And then cultural competence implies an objective set of best practices, right? It kind of, you'll often see in cultural competence that there are these kind of best practices that work, depending on cultures, and it's kind of laid out in this way, where cultural humility implies that even when we talk about best practices, they can also be subjective because they're made by different humans. And in fact, if you look at a lot of certain theories that have existed for a long time, often we have folks, so even take homelessness, right? People who are experiencing homelessness, for how long we've had policies and practices and even kind of culture, defined by people who do not have lived experience, right? Who've never been unhoused. And so one of the things cultural humility does is it says, what, we have to understand best practices is even subjective, and this is critical. We have to value and prioritize intentionally lived experience, right? So this goes back to honoring expertise of others. So if we're going to honor the expertise of others, right, we want to make sure that, if we're going to be setting policies and practices that impact people experiencing homelessness, people with lived experience and expertise need to be at the table, and not only at the table, but helping with the decision-making processes, right? The same goes if we're talking about race and ethnicity, right? Different races and ethnicities. So when we're doing this work, there's also this kind of idea of agency and honoring and making sure that we are listening to people's truths, right? And to those diverse truths. So we have another small group here for us today that we can kind of briefly touch on, but I wonder, I'm thinking about perhaps I'm changing this up a little bit. So I hope it's okay, Kristen and Donald and Heather. But I'm thinking since we are a smaller group today, maybe it makes more sense for us to just stay and discuss as a whole group instead of breaking out into small groups. Also, since a few folks are having some audio issues, maybe this allows people to kind of tune in a little more broadly, right? So I just want to share, right, when we think about cultural humility, there are many, many different layers to this. We acknowledge, first of all, cultural differences, right, that there are different facets and pieces to culture. And we're going to acknowledge those differences, and we're going to understand our own culture but really understand other people's culture by learning from other individuals, right? And being open to learning as well. That openness is really vital. Understanding our own culture. Along with this, it is understanding our own culture, but it's also being able to self-critique when needed. It's being able to unpack biases. Every single human being carries bias, right? Implicit bias. There's explicit bias, implicit bias, and we all have biases. A tool you all might want to check out, it's not a perfect tool by any means, but it can be a really helpful tool to reflect and start to do some introspective work, is the implicit association test by Harvard, and a bunch of researchers kind of designed it. And you can find the IAT tests. They're free to take, and you can actually find them in all sorts of topics, from race to even skin color. That reminds me, in ICF, we have a great colorism session we did earlier. You all might want to check out as well. There's some connections here. Thinking about, again, even things like body size, right? Political ideology. So it breaks out into many, many different things. And it can be a really good tool for you just to self-reflect, or within your community, if you have kind of a small group where you're working together to unpack and to do this work and to promote cultural humility, you could actually kind of decide to take one together and kind of unpack together and talk through it, right? So again, as with any assessment, not a perfect tool, but this one is a helpful tool, I think, in many ways, just to get us thinking and talking. Engaging in that self-assessment, right? So that's one example of a tool to help with self-assessment. Self-assessment is really, really important. It is a big part of how we learn, how we grow, and we have to be open, right, to feedback from others. We have to be open to, again, doing and engaging in reflective practice. Being able to acquire knowledge, skills, and viewing behavior within cultural contexts becomes important as well. Understanding context. And along with that, right, something that is really distinct to cultural humility is, along with the critical awareness to understand and actively dismantle power imbalances, is also a commitment to continue our lifelong learning and awareness of historic realities, right? The history of things like legacies of violence, legacies of oppression against certain groups of people. Think about slavery, racism, right? Sexism. Jillian brought up, examples of being a woman, right? And so thinking about that even in the larger context of ism, right? Ableism, heterosexism. We've done, through ICF, several equal access rule workshops, that have been really tackling some of that. Thinking about all of these isms, right? Even linguistic bias, religious, bias that may exist from different narratives and power hierarchies that exist. And so a part of this is understanding and saying, we're going to try our best to also understand history, right? And learn from individuals who are impacted by history, understand things like generational trauma and the connections to individual trauma. Understand an example I really appreciate that Donald brought up earlier, right, is how you may work in some communities where some people have a mistrust, right, of the government or of agencies. So trying to not just judge that, but say, let's unpack and look at the histories, right, and what might be different reasons for that, right? So there's this radical empathy that's also a piece of cultural humility. And that's different than just empathy, right? Empathy is saying we're going to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Radical empathy, as defined by many scholars, including the brilliant Black scholar Isabel Wilkerson in the book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, describes radical empathy as saying, sometimes I might not be able to put myself in someone's shoes, but I can certainly listen fully and openly and try my best to understand that person's experiences and honor their perspectives and their experiences. So here we have a little bit of a group discussion we can do together here. And looking at cultural humility principles, right? One, a lifelong commitment to learning and critical self-reflection. Two, a desire to fix power imbalances within our different work realms and dynamics. Three, institutional accountability and mutual respectful partnership based on trust. So if we were going to kind of think about and share, what elements do you feel you regularly practice, right? Even to be open and honest about it. What do you feel like, yeah, I do this, right? What about your organization? If you had to think about where your organization is on this, you know, can you check up 1, 2, and 3? Are you more in stage 1, right? What are some gaps? What are some areas for growth, right? That you think that, you know, here are some areas for myself to grow, or here are some areas for my organization where we really need to grow. And so we'll invite anybody and everybody to share. So we would love to hear from you. So if you're able to turn on your mic, if you want to turn on your camera, you can, but feel free to use the hand feature, or just, you can even talk out. We're, you know, in this space, we just want to have some discussion. You may need to take a moment to reflect as well, right? But looking especially at the 3 principles listed there. What do you think, you know, in terms of your own practice, but also your organization practice? What are some reflective connections you can make? And anybody can share.
Rajni, just wanted to share kind of with some transparency that no matter how long you've been doing this, or how well you think you got it, and how much of a lifelong learner you are, you'll make mistakes, or certainly if you're doing enough self-reflection, you'll know where there's a need to do some more work. In our organization, at the National Coalition, I'll use an example. We have at times, because we don't have people on our staff, and this is an intersectionality issue, that use pronouns other than the pronouns of their birth. So their cisgender pronoun. It has been a challenge sometimes when people that embrace other gender identities come into that space, and just, we had to do a whole workshop on understanding, you know, how to be sensitive to the pronouns of people that are not cisgendered. And so, you know, we didn't know there was a problem, and it didn't actually get out of hand at all. But we noticed that because the person was misidentified a few times, that there was a real need for us to do some introspective kind of investigation of ourselves, and also do some outward training so we could better embrace the cultures of that particular population. So that's an example of what you're asking for here, an organization taking those steps to be able to embrace, understand, and learn about other cultures that are outside of the ones that are inside the workplace.
I love that, right? That's awesome. And part of that, right? So even as we think about pronouns, this example Donald shares, right, is understanding too some of the historical pieces where a gender binary has often led to really horrific violence for people who are non-binary, for people who are trans. Even when we think about, you know, our trans community, historically, we have continued to see higher amounts of violence, hate crimes, even death in our homeless communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you start to see intersections there. And so that's where something's saying, okay, right, this might be something new for me, but I'm going to take the time to learn, right? The importance of pronouns. And maybe it's something that has not affected me personally, but I'm going to take the time to learn and to understand and practice for the collective advancement of equity and justice. So that's a great example, Donald. What else? Can somebody else share today? Heather, Myrelle, Hilda, Mark, Lisa, Ian.
So
Yep.
Melissa in the chat says that I try my best when I am completing an intake uh, to make sure the client feels empowered. I am not the expert of what the family needs. I am just a resource to help them. I want to give them the power to take control of their situation. On the other hand, my organization has some gaps. I think we need to expand our training surrounding judgments and openness. Great example. Great example. But and thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Because
that's
again, Rajni, and I think we didn't talk about it as much, but I think it really lends to the need for organizations to do a lot more around motivational interviewing. And that was a great example that we just had of actually listening to the client and giving them agency about where they want to go based on what you hear on the other side of that interview table. I think, one thing we miss a lot is the culture around where people actually want to live. If we're moving somebody into a permanent housing setting, you know, they may have embraced network poverty, meaning that they've always been in kind of a poverty environment, and they may feel comfortable going there. And we have to give them the agency, but it's also important for us to understand that and maybe help them with suggestions about other places where they could be comfortable and embrace community. So yeah, so actively listening is so important in cultural humility.
I love that. And the reflective process, right? So there's these kind of layers with cultural humility, asking us to kind of reflect individually. So we saw Melissa gave us a great example of that right now in the chat, right? But then also collectively within our organizations too, right? To do some of the deeper assessment work that needs to be done, and then having courageous, sometimes difficult, but really critical conversations about things that we need to change, things that, how do we grow in ways? Really, that becomes super, super important with this. And then again, listening, to others and learning from others, bringing in those perspectives and making sure this is ongoing. That's a huge piece of this. Did I see Q? Were you going to share something earlier, Q Tan? Q? Okay, I just want to make sure we don't miss anyone who had their hand. Does anybody else have an example or something they would like to share? Okay, and maybe you're wrestling with this, right? Kind of thinking about it. And that's okay. That's okay. That's a good place and space to be in as well with this.
I'll share something that the city is doing. So we
Yeah.
were awarded the encampment resolution funding from the state earlier this year. And so we've been working on resolving one of our historically impacted areas that really kind of is like the gateway and pathway for a lot of people that enter homelessness and experience that due to like there's a concentration of services and it being just in one of those areas that has historically experienced poverty. So we have been offering shelter in that specific location to alleviate displacement of environment. But what we've been doing is we've been trying to meet our participants where they are. So some do not participate well in shelter situations, either due to mental health issues or issues with authority. So what we've kind of flexed our services on is being able to provide services while they remain unsheltered, using our outreach team to provide additional information to those that they engage and build relationships with on what services would they be interested in, how can we provide them services where they are as being unsheltered within that encampment area, providing them navigation services while they are unsheltered, to help, house them from the street to permanent housing rather than putting them in a shelter with a roommate that they may not be familiar with or comfortable with or following the rules. I know we've gotten feedback from the community regarding visitation and allowing people to visit, but then still being able to respect others who don't want um, people to identify them or people to know that they're in that situation. So we've been trying to work with our community in that way to help improve that relationship and improve those access to services, including diversion. We want to continue offering case management after diversion and not just assume that once they're placed with a family member or with a friend or whatever their situation is, that they continue to receive that support after that diversion. So I think we're trying our best to listen to that community and listen to their needs, and building. I think our next phase is to build a committee of residents that are currently participating in our shelter to see what else we can do to help improve their experience the best that we can. And internally, they're hiring the service provider that we have works with the individuals and hires people with experience. And I know we experienced some technical that the city has to provide more technical support and more administration support for them because they don't have necessarily the skills and what we need in order to generate the reports, capture the appropriate information that the state's requiring, because our goal is to really resolve that encampment, and we need to really think about what that looks like. So I just wanted to share some of those things that we're trying to be more sensitive about and wanting to improve those relationships.
Thank you so much. That was just beautifully said, and what a great reflection, right? And that's a really good example. So even when we think about our kind of shelter system, understanding that often, right, so many of even our shelters and institutions in general operate from kind of a dominant norm, right? And so often, especially when we have diverse individuals, it can be very challenging for a number of reasons. You shared some of those reasons, right? Whether it's mental health challenges, whether it's a family situation, whether it's, separated men's and women's shelters. And for tribal nations, often we have many people who are two-spirit, right? And who have families, and that does not work, right? So understanding some of that and learning and saying, okay, well, how can we then rethink our systems, right? As opposed to expecting everybody to just fit into this system that was maybe created with a certain lens, right? A certain view. So I love that. That was really, really, thank you for sharing that and reflecting. Very powerful. And that's exactly the kind of reflection, right? For us to be able to identify even gaps and say, these are things we still need to do, right? These are things we're doing well. That kind of real intentional reflection is really important. So, upcoming in the rest of our series, we're going to be going through a lot more. And I wanted to give kind of a snapshot of some of that today. We're going to get even deeper into kind of understanding, again, cultural competence versus cultural humility, and even the continuum. When we talk about conscious cultural humility, what does that mean, right? What does that look like? What does that look like on institutional levels, but also on individual levels? And how do we use that to disrupt, right, cultural humility frameworks to disrupt inequitable systems? We're going to talk about, again, cultural humility and this connection to lifelong learning. So, part of why we had space today for people to reflect and share is that's a big part of cultural humility, is saying we're going to intentionally carve out that space to ask questions and to think about our own realms and spheres that we live in. And have really kind of critique and dialogue, right, and openness. How do we affirm diversity, right, and make sure that we're doing it in ways that honor other individuals and communities and our, diverse spectrum of brothers and sisters and human beings, right, all. As we get into promising practices, we're going to be looking at many models. So we hope that you can join us. And if you have colleagues that you think will benefit, please do send them to come into the space. We're going to look at models and dig into some practices and tools. Again, understanding that, part of cultural humility says we need a lot of different tools, and we need to know how to adapt and use tools that meet situations and contexts and communities and people at its best, right? And being able to kind of have that versatile toolbox. So one of the models we'll look at is humble. And we're going to really dive into this model next time we meet. I can't wait to share this. And Donald, we're going to share some examples as well when we get into it. And then we're going to start to understand, again, the levels and systems, right? Moving from knowledge to attitudes to skills, right? And so again, just a quick reminder before I turn it back over to our wonderful ICF host today, Heather and Kristen. Our next, we're going to meet again on September 8th. So if you are available, please join us. Let folks know, because we really carved this space out for folks to be able to be in beloved community, to share and to think and wrestle, and to all of us to grow in our work together, our critical work together. And then September 15th will be our part C, where we're going to do a lot more application process. And our emails, both Donald and my email are on here. So if you have any questions, there's something you need or something you'd like to see, don't hesitate to let us know, right? And we're so happy to share out. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Heather and Kristen. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you for attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief, Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next Racial Equity Series sessions. And we hope that you will complete the 3-question survey that will pop up as this session ends. Your feedback is critical in us ensuring these training sessions are what you need and what you're looking for. Thank you so much.